Welcome to Nyxbourne, where darkness whispers ancient secrets and reality bends at the edges of night. Every story here is a door to somewhere else, like a shadow yearning for flesh. We hunger for your subscription. Follow us into the dark, and don't forget to like, if you dare. Each click feeds the ancient algorithms. Each share spreads our whispers further. Join us. We've been waiting for you. Some doors should stay closed, but you're already here. Shall we begin? Every weathervane in Millbrook turned north that morning. Not gradually, not one by one, all at once, like invisible hands had seized them. Even the broken one atop the Methodist church, rusted in place for 30 years, creaked to life. The sound echoed through empty streets, a metallic groan that set neighborhood dogs howling in harmony with the awakening iron. Grace Chen noticed it first from her coffee shop window. The Lucky Bean, a converted Victorian townhouse that still bore the scars of its 1887 construction. The iron rooster that had watched over Main Street since the building's birth now pointed accusingly toward the hills, its tail feathers catching the weak October sun. She might have dismissed it as an odd coincidence if not for the way her bones seemed to hum with each gust of wind, a resonance that reminded her of her grandmother's warnings about the spirit world thinning in autumn. The morning crowd trickled in as usual, factory workers grabbing coffee before their shift, teachers planning their lessons over chai lattes, Sheriff Mills nursing his third espresso, while pretending not to watch Janet from the flower shop. Normal, routine, except for the wind. It carried whispers today, fragments of conversation that couldn't possibly be real. Old Lady Abernathy burst through the door at precisely 8:47 a.m., the brass bell above nearly flying off its mount. Her silver hair stood wild around her head like a storm cloud, her usually pristine tweed jacket buttoned wrong and flapping. "They're coming for us," she shrieked, bony fingers clutching at the counter. "The north wind brings the dead." The cafe fell silent. Even the espresso machine seemed to hold its breath. "Now, Martha," Sheriff Mills started, rising from his corner table. "Let's get you seated, and don't patronize me, John Mills. I heard them, clear as day, clear as my Harold's voice the day he passed. They're speaking to all of us now. The Weathervanes, they're their fingers, pointing the way, pointing home." Grace felt her grandmother's copper kettle grow cold in her hands. The antique was her most prized possession, passed down through 4 generations of Chen women. Each had added their own touches to the elaborate dragons and clouds etched into its surface. Her grandmother claimed the kettle had been blessed by a Taoist priest to ward off evil spirits. Right now, its surface felt like ice. That's when she heard it. A voice in the wind, slipping through the cracks around the window frames, curling into her ear like smoke. "Grace Chen, 3 days. The copper kettle burns. When the water boils black, you'll join us above." The kettle slipped from her numb fingers, but before it could shatter on the hardwood floors, Janet from the flower shop lunged forward and caught it. "Careful, honey. You look like you've seen a—" She stopped, her own face draining of color as the wind picked up outside. Her eyes went wide, fixed on something beyond the window that only she could see. By noon, the whispers had reached 13 people. Each carried a different prophecy, a different timeline, a different death. Some had hours, others weeks, all carried on that same north wind that smelled of frost and grave dirt. Father Morris called an emergency town meeting at St. Augustine's, the oldest church in Millbrook. Its weathervane, a simple cross that had survived 3 lightning strikes, cast a shadow that stretched all the way down the center aisle as people filed in. Grace noticed how everyone avoided stepping into that shadow. The pews filled quickly. She recognized faces she hadn't seen in church for years. Dr. Wagner from the university, who claimed to be an atheist, Ron Chen, no relation, who ran the hardware store and usually spent Sundays fishing. Even old man Patterson, who hadn't left his house since his wife died last spring. "This is mass hysteria, nothing more," Mayor Harrison declared from the pulpit, his words echoing off stone walls that had held secrets since before the Civil War. But his hands shook as he gripped the lectern, and Grace noticed he kept glancing at the weathervane visible through the church's rose window, still pointing north, always north. That's when Tommy Burke, age 6, tugged his mother's sleeve and asked, loud enough for the whole congregation to hear, "Mommy, why are there people hanging from the weathervanes?" Every head turned toward the windows. The weathervanes stood stark against the dying light, their shadows impossibly long, and in those shadows, Grace counted 13 swaying shapes before Father Morris drew the heavy velvet curtains, but not before she recognized one of the figures, not before she saw herself, 3 days from now, suspended from the iron rooster above her shop, her grandmother's copper kettle swinging from her hands like a pendulum marking time. The wind howled through Millbrook streets, and in its voice, Grace heard laughter. Back in the Lucky Bean, after the meeting dissolved into panic and prayers, Grace found an old leather-bound book waiting on her counter. She hadn't left it there. The pages were brittle with age, and when she opened it, dust motes danced in the fading sunlight. The text was handwritten, dated 1887, the year her building was constructed, the year all the weathervanes in Millbrook were forged. They came in winter, the first page read. They came with the north wind. They offered us prosperity, protection, guidance. All they asked in return was a place to rest, a perch from which to watch. But they lied. They always lie. And now they hunger again. Grace looked up at the iron rooster, its shadow stretching across her floor like an accusing finger. The wind whispered her name again, and this time she understood why it sounded familiar. It was her own voice, calling from 3 days in the future. Grace spent that night in her apartment above the Lucky Bean, surrounded by salt lines her grandmother had taught her to pour, and protective symbols drawn in red ink on every window. The leather book lay open on her kitchen table, its pages filled with increasingly frantic entries from Millbrook's past. The writer, Elizabeth Woodbury, had been the town's librarian in 1887. Her neat script grew messier as the entries progressed, until the final pages were nearly illegible, written in what looked suspiciously like dried blood. November 15th, 1887. The winter came early that year. The crops had failed, the mine had collapsed, and half the town was ready to abandon Millbrook to the wilderness. That's when the stranger arrived, riding the north wind. He carried 13 weathervanes in his wagon, each one a masterwork of iron and artistry. Said they would change the town's fortune, if only we would agree to his terms. December 1st, 1887. The prosperity he promised came true. The mine reopened, richer than ever. The winter wheat sprouted through the snow, but the dreams have started. Everyone dreams of flying now, of dancing on the wind, of watching the town from above. December 13th, 1887. God forgive us. The weathervanes aren't decorations, they're cages, and what we trapped inside them is getting hungry. A bang from the roof made Grace jump. The iron rooster was rotating again, its shadow sweeping across her ceiling like the hand of a clock. The wind carried voices tonight. Not just whispers, but fragments of conversations from 1887 echoing down through time. Just 13 souls every 13 years, the voices sang. A small price for prosperity, for protection, for power. The next morning, Janet from the flower shop was gone. They found her car in the parking lot, driver's door open, engine still running. A trail of chrysanthemum petals led to the base of her shop's weathervane, an elegant iron hummingbird that now pointed north, like all the others. Sheriff Mills tried to organize a search party, but the wind had grown stronger. It howled down Main Street, carrying the scent of winter roses and fresh graves. No one wanted to stay outside for long, not with the shadows the weathervanes cast, shadows that moved independently of the sun, reaching like hungry fingers. Grace took the leather book to Dr. Wagner at the university. The professor's prophecy had been the longest, 2 weeks until the campus weathervane, a scholarly owl, would supposedly claim him. He'd barricaded himself in his office, surrounded by historical records and meteorological data. "The pattern's clear," he said, not looking up from his computer. Charts and graphs covered his walls, tracking weathervane movements and wind patterns back decades. Every 13 years, 13 people disappear. The town prospers. Everyone forgets. But look. He pointed to a series of newspaper headlines. 1887, Millbrook miracle. Failing town sees sudden revival. 1900, unprecedented prosperity. As Millbrook enters, new century. 1913, town weathervanes, historic preservation. Project approved. 1926, Millbrook defies depression. Local economy. Booms and on, every 13 years, accompanied by small articles about missing persons, each set of disappearances explained away by mundane causes. "The bargain renews itself," Wagner whispered, "but this time, something's different. They've never shown us our deaths before. Never warned us. Why now?" A gust of wind rattled his office window. The owl weathervane outside turned, its bronze eyes catching the light. For a moment, they looked alive. "Because the hunger grows," the wind answered. "Because iron rusts, and bonds weaken, and 13 souls are no longer enough." Grace felt the copper kettle grow cold in her bag. 2 days left. The iron rooster waited. That afternoon, Tommy Burke disappeared from the elementary school playground. Witnesses said he'd been pointing at something in the sky, smiling. Just before he vanished, he'd told his teacher, "The weathervane people want to play hide and seek." They found his tiny handprint pressed into the iron of the school's weathervane, a playful dolphin that now seemed to be laughing. Grace returned to the Lucky Bean and found old Lady Abernathy waiting. The elderly woman sat at the counter, her silver hair now streaked with iron gray, her eyes reflecting something ancient and knowing. "Your grandmother," she said without preamble. She wasn't just a collector of antiques, was she? Grace's hand went to the copper kettle. "How did you?" She knew what lived in the wind, what hungered in the iron. She left protections, didn't she? Blessings, wards. Abernathy's fingers traced patterns in the condensation on the counter. They looked like the symbols Grace had drawn on her windows. Smart woman, but she knew this day would come, when the bargain would need to be broken. "How do you know all this?" The old woman smiled, and for a moment her teeth looked sharp. "Because I was there in 1887, child. I was supposed to be one of the 13, but I made a different bargain. And now I can't die until the weathervanes fall." Outside, the iron rooster creaked in the wind, waiting, hungry. Grace opened her grandmother's kettle and found a hidden compartment in its base. Inside was a single iron nail, its head carved with symbols that made her eyes hurt to look at them. "The stranger's wagon," Abernathy whispered. "Your grandmother pulled this from its wheel before he left. The nail that held it all together, and now." The wind screamed. Every weathervane in Millbrook spun wildly, their shadows writhing like tortured things. They had heard. The last sunset before Grace's prophecy painted Millbrook's weathervanes in crimson light. They cast shadows like bleeding wounds across the town, their iron forms humming with anticipation. The north wind had grown so strong, it howled like a living thing, carrying fragments of old prayers and older screams. 10 people had vanished now. Only 3 prophecies remained unfulfilled: Grace's, Dr. Wagner's, and Mayor Harrison's. The iron rooster above the lucky bean tracked her movements with ruby eyes that had been blank metal just hours before. Your grandmother knew this moment would come, Old Lady Abernathy said, her ancient fingers tracing the symbols on the iron nail. They sat in Grace's apartment as darkness fell, surrounded by guttering candles and salt lines. She spent her life preparing for it. The kettle, the nail, the bloodline, all of it leading to this night. But why me? Grace watched her own shadow on the wall, cast by candlelight. It seemed to move independently, reaching upward like smoke. "Because you're the 13th generation since the first bargain. Numbers have power, child. 13 souls, 13 years, 13 generations. The circle wants to close." The wind screamed through the cracks around the windows, and in its voice Grace heard her grandmother singing the lullaby she'd learned as a child. The words were different now, their true meaning clear. Iron wings against the sky. Watch the weather vanes spin by. When the north wind starts to sing, break the chain and clip their wings. "They're not just weather vanes, are they?" Grace whispered. "They're doors, anchors, keeping something tied to our world." Abernathy's smile showed too many teeth. The stranger wasn't human. He rode the spaces between worlds, selling bargains to desperate towns, prosperity for sacrifice, protection for souls. But iron rusts, and hunger grows, and now... A crash from outside cut her off. Dr. Wagner stood in the middle of Main Street, a flare gun pointed at the campus weathervane. The scholarly owl's eyes blazed as he fired, the phosphorus round striking its iron wings. The sound that followed wasn't metal. It was flesh. The weathervane twisted, its form melting and reshaping. The owl became something ancient, something that had worn countless shapes across countless worlds. Its wings spread like torn shadows, and its cry shattered every window on the street. Wagner didn't scream when it took him. He laughed, wild and free, as he rose into the air. "I understand now," he shouted. "The symmetry, the beautiful mathematical precision of it all." Then he was gone, leaving only equations written in frost on the pavement. The remaining weather vanes began to change. The iron rooster's head split open like a flower blooming, revealing rows of teeth that had been hiding in the metalwork all along. The church's cross became a writhing mass of angles that hurt to look at. The school's dolphin grew legs, the hardware store's compass sprouted eyes, and all of them began to sing. The bargain breaks, the iron fails. Time to spread our twisted sails. 13 souls no longer bind. Now we'll take all humankind. Mayor Harrison ran down the street, his expensive suit torn, his eyes wild. "We can fix this," he screamed at the sky. "We can make a new deal. My soul for the town's safety. Please." The wind took him mid-stride. His body rose, twisting like a puppet, and disappeared into the mouth of the courthouse weathervane. A scales of justice that now dripped something that wasn't water. Grace felt the copper kettle grow hot in her hands. The iron nail pulsed like a heartbeat. Your grandmother knew the true power wasn't in the iron, Abernathy said softly. It was in the spaces between, the points where worlds touch, like the moment between breathing in and breathing out, like the instant between tick and tock. Grace understood that the kettle had never been meant to hold tea. It had been designed to hold something else, something that could flow between worlds. She ran to the lucky bean as the weathervanes began to descend, their true forms unfolding like origami nightmares. The iron rooster's shadow reached for her with hands that had been hidden in its tail feathers for over a century. The north wind howled her name, but she heard her grandmother's voice beneath it, speaking in Mandarin. Iron binds, but copper flows. The nail opens, but love closes. Your blood remembers. Grace Chen stood in her grandmother's shop, holding her grandmother's kettle, feeling 13 generations of wisdom flow through her veins. The nail grew warm in her hand as the things that had been weathervanes circled above, their hunger a tangible force. She began to sing the lullaby, but changed the words, changed the pattern, changed the bargain. The kettle boiled without fire, and when she poured, what flowed out wasn't water. It was time itself, liquid moments cascading over the iron nail, washing away rust and years and hunger. The nail drove itself into the threshold of the lucky bean, and reality rippled. The weathervanes screamed as new lines of power drew them in, no longer bound by iron, but caught in something stronger. The weight of memory, the power of thresholds, the strength of 13 generations choosing to protect rather than bargain. Grace felt the wind change. The things that had been weathervanes twisted, caught between forms, trapped in the spaces they had once ruled. The iron rooster's eyes met hers as it began to fade. We'll return, it promised in a voice like grinding metal. Hunger always returns. But I'll be waiting, Grace answered. We'll all be waiting. The sun rose on a quieter Millbrook. The weathervanes were gone, leaving only empty posts against the sky. The missing people were found scattered through town, dazed but alive, with no memory of their time in the iron realm. Old Lady Abernathy had vanished with the wind, leaving only a note written in copper ink. The bargain is broken, but watching is eternal. Your grandmother would be proud. Grace Chen still runs the lucky bean. The copper kettle sits in the window, catching the light. Sometimes, when the wind blows from the north, customers swear they hear it humming an old lullaby, and if you look carefully at the threshold, you might see an iron nail holding worlds together, its head carved with symbols that tell a story of bargains broken and bindings renewed. But that's only if you know where to look, and only if you're willing to see. As our tale fades into shadow, remember that darkness is patient, eternal, waiting for your return. Until next time, feed your nightmares with a subscription, mark your territory with a like, and share our whispers with those who dare to listen. The night is calling, and Nyxbourne never sleeps. Stay with us. There are so many more stories to tell.